Ladies and gentlemen, welcome one and all to this UK Lawyers for Israel webinar. My name is Jonny Gould, and as of this week, my podcast became the biggest Jewish and Israeli podcast in English outside the United States. And one of the reasons why is there's an interview with Jonathan Turner in the series. Scroll down and find Jonathan's work after this webinar. But today, we're going to focus on stopping boycotts against Israel in sport, the very difficult issue of tackling soft power. And as our good friend, Professor Gerald Steinberg of NGO Monitor told me in the Last But One podcast, soft power can indeed be extremely lethal. So I'm very happy to introduce our expert panel today. First of all, in the bottom left-hand corner, I don't know if it screens as I'm seeing it, as you're seeing it, but Simon Johnson is just beneath me there on the screen. He is the Chief Executive of the Jewish Leadership Council and Chairman of the Rugby Football League. We have Sam Green from UK Lawyers for Israel, who launched the UKLFI action against the World Badminton Federation, International Judo Federation, International Paralympic Committee, and others. And the Chief Executive of UK Lawyers for Israel, who dealt with the attempt to get Israel suspended from FIFA. It's, of course, our friend Jonathan Turner. Jonathan, let's start with the Governor. Here we are, and thank you very much for welcoming us all today. Can you just give us an overview of what UK Lawyers for Israel is trying to do in relation to international sport? What is the grand plan?
Yes, well, we're now under lockdown and not much sport is happening, but we hope that life as we once knew it will return. And sport is, of course, very important to many people. And in the past, Israeli competitors and teams have frequently been boycotted or ostracized in international sport. Sometimes Israelis have been prevented from competing altogether. Alternatively, they may have been allowed to compete, but not as Israelis. No Israeli flag, no national anthem, no Israeli place in the medals table. In other cases, matches have had to be played in empty stadia, or in other occasions, other competitors or teams have refused to play Israelis and forfeited the match. And treating Israeli competitors like non-persons is not only detrimental and distressing for those directly affected, but also has the effect of delegitimizing Israelis and Israel generally, and suggesting that they're fair game for anything else, that they should be treated like pariahs. Conversely, of course, sport can be a great way towards mutual understanding and normal relations and eventually peace. Now, international sports associations have rules prohibiting discrimination and in many cases also prohibiting any form of disrespect. And boycotts clearly breach these rules. So at UK Lawyers for Israel, we thought that as lawyers, we could do something about this by invoking these rules and pointing out that they're not being observed. And by doing so, we'll not just be helping Israeli sportspersons, we'll be forcing other countries to recognize Israelis as equal human beings and Israel as a legitimate and equal state. And a most striking recent example of this was the Abu Dhabi Judo tournament, but I'll leave that for Sam to talk about because he led our work on that.
Tell you what, Jonathan, I did find the very stirring national anthem that was played at that event, and actually put it in our podcast. So that's the final reference I'll make to the podcast, I promise you, at least for the next 15 minutes. So I understand that actually that you were personally involved, and this was a very serious attempt at delegitimization of Israel within football, in stopping the Palestinian attempt to get Israel actually banned from FIFA. And of course, it sounds preposterous, but these things at international level can catch fire. We see the UN all the time attempting to delegitimize Israel, and Hillel Neuer fighting a sort of one-man battle in Geneva to try and stop that. So this is a big soft power issue, trying to get Israel suspended from FIFA. What was the actual problem, and what did you do about it?
Well, the Palestinians actually had a superficially attractive argument because the FIFA statute prohibits its member associations from organising football matches in the territory of another member association without its consent. And the Israeli Football Association operates a football league, and there are several teams in its lower divisions that are based in the West Bank. And the Palestinian Football Association said, that's our territory, and we haven't consented, and this is a flagrant violation of the rules. And as you mentioned, Jonny, usually in a worldwide body, when the Palestinians have even a superficially valid point like this, Israel's likely to lose, because most countries are sympathetic to the Palestinian cause and regard the West Bank as Palestinian territory and Israeli settlements there as an illegal barrier to peace. And in addition, you have, in these cases, major NGOs with large resources. In this case, it was Human Rights Watch and Diaconia. They piled in to seize the opportunity to undermine Israel. So I was concerned that even though it might seem preposterous, actually, we had a real risk of losing this one. And there were four main strands to the work we did to assist in stopping it. And I should say a lot of other people were involved. But I think our most important contribution, what I call the first strand, it was important because no one else really did this point. It was to provide a valid defense to the charge that the Palestinians were making, that the Israeli Football Association was breaching FIFA rules by organising football matches in the territory of the Palestinian Football Association without its consent. And our argument was that the territory of a sports association is not always the same as a political territory. And actually we showed that this argument is backed by rulings of the Court of Arbitration for Sport. And we said that the territory of a football association is the area in which it normally organises matches. The territory of the Palestinian Football Association doesn't include...
We just
yeah? So we argued that the territory of the Palestinian Football Association...
We're having a bit of difficulty.
Hello?
Yeah, we just sort of, you patched in and out just for a second.
Can
you
sorry.
scroll back about 10 or 15 seconds and then we can come back 10 or 15 seconds back. We just lost you for a short while. Just 10 or 15 seconds.
Okay, you can hear me now, I hope.
Perfectly.
Yeah. Okay. So our argument was that the territory of a sports association is not always the same as a political territory, and this argument is actually backed by rulings of the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which is the international tribunal which is used by FIFA for its disputes. We argued that the territory of a football association is the area in which it normally organises matches. So the territory of the Palestinian Football Association does not include Israeli settlements or Area C of the West Bank, because the Palestinian Football Association has never organised football matches there. And we buttress this argument by showing that there are lots of other disputed areas around the world where football clubs play in the league of the country that governs them, even though its claim to the territory is disputed. We had some help from a superb volunteer, Jessica Goldfinch. She did some great research on this, finding out all the details of the evidence supporting this point. I think Jessica is in the audience, so thank you very much, Jessica. And that really did strengthen our case, because it was a warning to FIFA that if they accepted the Palestinian claim, they would open up a really big can of worms, because lots of other people could say, well, this association is organising football matches in our territory and so on. And I think this defence argument, directly countering the Palestinian charge, was very important. If we hadn't made it, the Israeli Football Association would have had an open goal at the back, and I think we could quite well have lost. So anyway, that was the first strand of our argument. The second strand, which we pursued together with others, was to counterattack, to submit complaints that the Palestinian Football Association were themselves violating numerous FIFA rules by using football to glorify terrorists, by preventing Palestinians playing football with Israelis, by denigrating Israelis and Jews. And it's fair to say that some people advised us against upping the ante in this way. And I understand their rationale, but I was persuaded by the very formidable Brooke Goldstein at the Lawfare Project in New York, who asked, does the Israeli football team always only play in defence? And I suspect Brooke may not have actually seen the Israeli football team play a match and might have asked a different question if she had, but perhaps we'd better not go there. Anyway, the third strand, also in conjunction with others, particularly Maurice Hirsch at Palestinian Media Watch, was to explain the history of the West Bank and Israeli claims, showing that this is a complex issue in which FIFA should not get involved. And this neutralised the simplistic assertions of the Palestinians and sporting NGOs that the Israeli Football Association was organising football matches on stolen Palestinian land and so on, which showed that it's actually much more complicated than that, and not something to be for determination by a sports body. And the result was clear. The FIFA Council dismissed the Palestinian complaint against the Israel Football Association, and all of these strands that I mentioned seem to have been recognised in the statement of the FIFA Council. The first sentence said that they carried out a thorough legal consultation, and they went on to say that the current situation is characterised by exceptional complexity and sensitivity, and FIFA must remain neutral on political matters. And finally, they said that the FIFA Council decided to refrain from imposing any sanctions on either the Israeli Football Association or the Palestinian Football Association, which I think suggests that the complaints against the Palestinian Football Association also had some impact and was helpful to safeguarding our position. And just very quickly, the fourth strand was when the Palestinian Football Association appealed to the Court of Arbitration in Sport. So we tried to be applied to intervene in case it was necessary to neutralise any nasty submissions by NGOs like Human Rights Watch containing a whole load of misleading propaganda. And the upshot of this was the court firmly rejected our application of intervene, saying they didn't want to hear from third parties who had no direct interest in the matter. But that was great because it meant that they couldn't have interventions from Human Rights Watch or Diaconia or whatever.
So let's just say it was 0-0 after extra time and no one decided to go to penalties. So let's turn now to Simon Johnson, who is the chair of the Rugby Football League and also chief executive of the Jewish Leadership Council. I know that you were also involved in this alongside it, which gives you an idea of the sort of the federation, the kind of help that all the lawyers and council give to each other in order to fight for the benefit of Israel. And I wanted to ask you, Simon, about FIFA. And you know, perhaps you can sort of take it on with FIFA to other events that have been affected in such ways.
Well, thank you, because to follow your football analogy, Jonny, what Jonathan has just been describing about has been the second leg of a two-legged match. The first leg was when in 2015 the Palestinian Football Association, this was when the whole thing started, put through a politically motivated resolution directly onto the agenda of the FIFA Congress. So before there was such a thing as a FIFA Council, to propose the suspension of the Israeli Football Association, and they came up with some spurious arguments to do it. This required, there was really very little that was legal that was required for that. And I'm a former sports lawyer and used to work in a senior position at the Football Association. And one of the things that I think stood me in good stead is a piece of advice that I always give to young people. Whenever you are in your career, never, ever lose contact with anybody you've dealt with. You never know when that will come in useful. And in 2015, all of the contacts I was able to make in the football world came in very useful because I was able to deal with them. Many of them had become senior members of the FIFA executive at that point, and explain to them about how problematic this was. Now, the issue where the legal element comes into it, the FIFA statutes at the time allowed another member association to propose directly to the FIFA Congress the suspension or expulsion of another member. Now, arising out of what happened, we recommended, and I think FIFA did this, and we've recommended that the Israelis should do it with all other sports federations, that they should change those statutes to make it clear that you cannot just have a politically motivated attempt by another member organization to expel or suspend a third organization. That has to come from, it has to have good cause, and it should ideally come from the executive of the sport. So what happened in 2015, and it was wrapped up in all the arrests of all the FIFA executive members. That was the day of the famous FBI raid on the FIFA hotel. But what they did was they didn't vote on the Palestinian resolution, and in the end they kicked it off into a specialist committee to examine this, and it was that specialist committee that came up with that was got at by the Palestinians about this point about the West Bank, which was where the second leg of the match came in. And that's why I would summarize this part, just this part, to say that when you're dealing with sporting boycotts, there are three relevant ways that you have to deal with it, and they're all equally useful and relevant. One is, of course, legal. The second is political, with a small p and a big P. And the third is sporting. And the way we were able to make those arguments to FIFA was to say on a sporting level that they did not want to get involved in complex international political disputes because they're a sports governing body. Now, I want to move on from that if I can, because we've spent quite a bit of time on something that we collectively successfully achieved, because had FIFA thrown Israel out, it would have been devastating, and it would have started a snowball rolling, and other sports would have done the same. I want to talk about boycotting of Israelis at sporting events, and just briefly talk before to let you go to somebody else on the contractual element. And this is where I want to praise FIFA, because within the hosting agreements that all of the World Cup and international tournament hosts have to sign is a provision contractually that any team that qualifies for the event, their players, athletes, coaches and officials must all be allowed to enter the country to participate in the tournament. Their fans must have equal access to tickets as fans of other countries, and the flag and anthem of the country must be used and respected by all other participants and in each tournament venue. So Qatar 2022, the next FIFA World Cup, we should all be encouraging the Israeli FA to do everything they can to get Israel to qualify, because Qatar will then have to fly the Israeli flag, ensure that the Israeli anthem is played before each match, and allow all Israelis to come along and watch the event, which will be quite something. And I think that where we've had problems with international tournaments, and this probably will lead on to what Sam's going to talk about, is where the contractual position for the host country is not as strong as that. Because what should happen is that a host country should have these complete equanimity provisions within them of complete equal treatment of all participating nations. And that if they don't, they should have the tournament taken away from them. And their right to host the tournament should be withdrawn because they will be in breach of a hosting agreement. So in order to best protect Israeli athletes from being prevented from participating, or Israeli flags or anthems from being used at the tournament, you need to ensure that the federation puts that into the contractual agreement between themselves and the host nation or city.
I think we are all gunning for Israel to qualify for Qatar 2023 at this stage. And just a bit of news in that I think Lionel Messi's Hebrew name is in fact Laser Messias. And I think there's a possibility that he might renounce his Argentinian citizenship to come and play for Israel in time for that, if Argentina don't qualify. Let's move on to introduce Sam Green. Sam, welcome to this webinar. Let's talk about judo here, because FIFA is one thing, and again, as Simon warned, if we hadn't fought so hard to maintain the argument for Israel, then everything would have fallen by snowballs. But then there are major issues in sports, perhaps with a slightly more focused audience, which might fall under the radar. Judo, could you tell us a bit more about the challenge to boycotts on Israel in that sport?
Yeah, this ties in, Jonny, really nicely with what Simon was just saying, and because I'm not really dealing with contractual stuff, and it is clearly important that we get those contracts in place. But one problem that the next hurdle with the other two prongs of his fight that he was talking about might be needed then, because then we've got to get the other party to enforce the contract. But I'll leave that to one side for the moment. And the reason judo is a really good example, because it engages with all of that, but it also shows what can be done. In 2017, Abu Dhabi has this annual Judo Grand Slam, which is authorized under the auspices of the International Judo Federation. And at that event, Israel was banned. Individuals were allowed to compete, but not as Israelis. They were stateless individuals. There was no Israeli team, no Israeli flag, no emblems, and when they won medals, which they did, there was no national anthem. And then that continued on to the International Judo Federation website, which isn't based in Abu Dhabi. There was no mention of the fact the Israeli team wasn't allowed to participate, certainly no condemnation. And the players who took part were listed as being without a country. But as we know, they do have a country, they do have a flag, they have emblems, and they have a national anthem. And following our representation, as we've already heard, following our representation and also representations from other people, of course, the IJF, the Judo Federation, put its house in order. They did an exemplary job. Abu Dhabi was told that unless they guaranteed fair and equal participation, they would not be allowed to hold their Judo Grand Slam again. And they gave the guarantees. And the very next year, in 2018, an Israeli team took part under an Israeli flag with Israeli emblems on their outfits. And when they won gold medals, which they did, and Jonny's heard it, he's told us about that, they played Hatikva, the Israeli national anthem.
Beautiful. It really was. It was beautiful. And I think they probably played it on the 6 o'clock news in Israel because the commentator, Baruch Davis, I think his name was, he actually sung the Hatikva down the telephone line with it. It was a very emotional moment. I think Miri Regev was there as well, wasn't she?
That's exactly right. Not only was all of that happening, but the Israeli sports minister was there to hear it happen, and you heard it a little bit later. But judo didn't stop there. In the same year, the judo world champion, who was an Iranian, he defected, and the reason he gave for defecting was that he was not allowed to play against Israelis. And the year after that, which is 2019. The International Judo Federation said that the Iranian Federation was suspended indefinitely for the explicit reason that they don't allow their competitors to play against Israelis. So from airbrushing Israel out of a sport to becoming a role model for sport, judo's really done a great job.
Sam, it's heartening to hear that judo was able to put its house in order, but what happens if there is a corruption, a belligerence within that governing body that is, I don't know, for example, you see China and the Arab nations really corrupting so-called human rights within the UN. What happens if there's someone from a host nation involved in judo that's in the pocket of the country and refuses to change matters for Israel?
Well, we're a rule-based organisation, and we deal with rules. And if people are breaking the rules, all we can really do is a couple of things. We can seek to enforce the rules and try and ensure that organisation enforces, and we can go beyond that. I'll come to that actually a little bit more later. But the other thing we do then is we go to the other things that Simon was talking about. We tell the world that that's what's happening. We don't let it get swept under the rug, and we make it explicit that that's what's going on.
Simon, would you like to come in on that?
Yeah, I would, if that's all right, Jonny, because you've hit on a good thing. Not every sports federation is free of corruption, shall we say, and a number of federations struggle with all of that, and some of them will completely ignore rules, regulations, contracts, and so on. And if a federation is not tough enough, then all the legal arguments are not going to work. That's why I talked about the two other areas, sporting and political. And I think it's worth bearing in mind that whilst we in the Western European nations can offer help and assistance to Israel at times like this, and often we are asked to do so, actually the first obligation to protect against that comes from the Israeli delegate to those federations in the first place. Every federation has international has representatives from their participating nations. Almost every federation admits Israel, and there's only a very small number that don't. So Israel does have delegates at those organizations. I think it is incumbent upon Israeli delegates appointed by the government or appointed by their federation who are active within those federations to build relationships and to be able to deploy political levers themselves. That was why one of the pieces of advice I gave after we had won the first leg of the FIFA battle was that the delegates, the Israeli delegates to every sporting federation should now set about working through their structures to ensure that rules could be changed to stop these types of suspension resolutions going on. It's very, very important that Israeli sport plays to its full strength. And they have tended not necessarily to do that. And I think by the time they come to UK Lawyers for Israel or us or any of the lawyers or colleagues who are on this call, I have to say by that point it's too late. That point we're coming from behind. And I think that's why Israel needs to be a bit smarter working politically through the federations that they are part of.
Can I ask a question of Jonathan Turner now, and maybe the rest of the panel can also answer this, and then we'll move to the Q&A. The growing international muscle of China, and we've already seen breaches of copyrights and scant respect for rules on international law as they try and build their, I don't know, soft power diplomatic might around the world. What challenge is this, Jonathan, to the international rules-based world that you operate in?
Well, I think we can. First of all, I think it's important to treat. I'm saying my internet connection is unstable. Can people still hear me?
Yes.
China and Chinese people attach a great deal of weight to that, and I think the first thing to do you only treat them as hostile if there's no other way of dealing with them. So I would say that in the first place, there are plenty of areas where Israel has opportunities for common ground with China and Chinese, and I don't think that should be overlooked. But perhaps more generally, as a legal organisation, we're always looking at the objective rules and saying, well, there is this rule that you have to not discriminate, you have to treat your opponent with proper respect, and we just want you to observe the rules. And where you have an association which, for whatever reason, and we don't know what goes on behind closed doors, is not complying with the rules, there are ways in which we can push further. There are you ask your friends to help, but also there are other ways. So when the Judo Federation seemed to be not quite pulling out its finger when we first contacted them, we actually contacted the International Olympic Committee and asked them to look into it. And of course, judo is an Olympic sport and has to comply with the International Olympic Committee rules. And that did actually seem to have some impact on the International Judo Federation that we'd done that. And in the case of FIFA, another angle, Simon was immensely helpful and obviously knew a lot of people at FIFA. But we also spoke to a wonderful Spanish lawyer called Ignacio Wenley, who's done a lot of the cases in Spain against boycotts by councils. And he said, well, actually, I think there's a really an angle that will be of great interest to the Spanish officials and Spanish government here, because we have a little problem in Spain. It's called Catalonia, and we certainly don't want an international sports body taking decisions on what is or is not a state, or what boundaries are, or anything like that. We don't want them intervening in politics. He got our submission in front of relevant officials in Spain. And I think they, of course, Spain has good relations with Spanish-speaking countries, and there are a lot of them around the world, and they're important in the world of football. And I think that was also a very important help to us in getting the result that we did.
Sam, can I return to you and talk about a completely new sport that we haven't really mentioned so far? We've touched on the Olympics, but what about the Paralympics? Big enough in industry now to have its political problems. Apparently, we also saw a levelling of the playing field. What happened there?
Paralympics turned out to be another good example, actually. In 2019, Malaysia was given the World Swimming Championships, and they blithely announced that Israelis wouldn't be given visas for it. And they did that a little bit in advance, so we needed to act before it could become a fait accompli. We pointed out that that involved 14 multiple breaches of 14 different chapters of their code. And we also listed all the anti-Semitic comments by their Prime Minister. And we said, IPC rules demand that they either guarantee entry, it's what Simon's talking about with the contracts, they guarantee entry or they lose the championships. And because we had a bit of time in advance, our efforts and the efforts of others were able to achieve that result. The Paralympics were taken away, the swimming championship was taken away from Malaysia and moved to London explicitly because of the move to ban Israelis. And it was particularly unpleasant with the Paralympics because the founder of the Paralympic movement, a man called Sir Ludwig Guttmann, was himself someone who had to flee from anti-Semitic persecution and discrimination. And Israel had showed that there is no better friend to the Paralympic movement than Israel, because in 1968, when Mexico was supposed to hold the Games, and they just said they weren't going to do it, Israel said, well, come here, do it here. And that's what happened. So it would have been a pretty unpleasant way of honouring Sir Ludwig Guttmann and repaying the favour that Israel had done to them.
I think one of the things that helps, sorry, if I can just jump in, one of the things that helps is the IPC is based, is very English influenced, and it's politically comes a lot, it's covered a lot by sort of Western values. And I think that's why I think the legal arguments that were made fell on receptive ears, because, they come from the type of background that we have, which is about fairness and equality and so on.
Unusually, Simon, in what Jonathan was talking about before, they're not, weirdly, they're not covered in any way by the IOC. They're a completely separate organisation. Correct. The rules are completely separate. But correct. Something that I was able to mention there, and exactly because of where they're situated in Germany, was, and from a legal point of view, I pointed out that, they've got rules. If they're not enforcing their rules, they're a members' organisation. Their members have got an action against the organisation in not enforcing the rules of that organisation, and any or all of their members, and nobody wants that hanging over them. And the other point is that because they're in Germany and the atmosphere you've got there are very strong anti-discrimination laws, also EU ones. And if an organisation isn't enforcing its own anti-discrimination rules, that might be of interest under German anti-discrimination laws.
We have questions from audience, from to the panel. Firstly, David Saunders, and then we'll talk to Sunil. Question from John Wilkin, and then from Jenny Sedov. And I believe one or two other questions are coming in now. Your chance now to type them in, and while our experts are here. Firstly, David Saunders. Thank you for your question to the panel. His is, what does an Israeli athlete need to do to be accepted by the international community at large? After all, Israel is considered mostly European for sporting reasons, as the Middle Eastern, Asian and African authorities won't play them in their jurisdictions, as evidenced by Israel being put under UEFA. The irony about all that, I think, Simon, from a footballing point of view, is that this permanent ostracization from Israel playing Syria and Lebanon all the time is that losing to Denmark and losing to Greece, losing to Scotland and England actually raises the Israeli bar much, much higher, because we beat silly old Lebanon 5-0 all the time.
I actually think that in all the time that I've been trying to stop, to promote a more positive view of Israel in the sporting community, the biggest contributor to that was when Israel and England were drawn in the same group in the 2008 European Championships. 5,000 England fans went to Israel, had a fantastic experience, and that did more hadrakah than anything else I've ever been involved with. I think that the question that Mr. Saunders has asked, technically Israeli athletes are and can welcome and can participate anywhere. What you have is the situation where certain quirks exist. One quirk is that Israel belongs to UEFA rather than the Asian Football Confederation, as it should do. And in most other territories, they simply give up trying to force athletes from Iran, Syria, Iraq, and other countries from refusing to participate against the athletes by allowing Israel to participate in the European federations. My view is quite simple on this. If, as we found in the judo situation and in other situations, athletes refuse to participate against in fair competition under the rules with Israeli athletes, then those athletes should be expelled from the competition. They should be thrown out, and their federation should be thrown out. The rules of competitions allow that anybody who participates and qualifies should be able to participate, and that the sports governing bodies should be prepared to be tough on this, and that if we see any of this showboating by athletes refusing to participate, then throw them out. And that's the simple way to do it. And I think if that happens and more governing bodies take that tough approach, then these problems will start to disappear.
A question for Sam now comes from Sunil. Thank you, Sunil. Is the falsehood that Israel is an apartheid state an argument used by various entities while attempting to push through boycott in sports? And if so, how can this be countered? It is the perennial story for every single Israel advocate, this terrible lie of the apartheid state.
Well, it's not something that we can. It's used all the time, of course, because it's a way to delegitimize, and we kind of almost need to not go down the rabbit hole. Israel is a member of all these organizations in good standing, and as long as that persists, these organizations have their rules and there's all these contractual things. They should be allowed to play. And anybody who doesn't want to play with them, who does the showboating that Simon was just talking about, should have the rules enforced against them. Obviously, that's the hard part. Now, if we get to situations where organizations themselves are saying that Israel is an illegitimate state because of its apartheid and all that kind of stuff, well, then that changes the argument. Then it's a different battle. Then we've got to start dealing with that organization, and then you take it onto the IOC, you take it onto the courts. But at the moment, Israel is a country in good standing. It's the Dershowitz point. Judge Israel as you judge every other country. And if you're not calling out every country in the world for everything, then you can't call out Israel for them either. So you push it to one side.
Okay, I've got a question specifically now for Jonathan, because you were persuaded to go on the attack during the FIFA battle to stop the delegitimization of Israel. So John is asking this question. Thank you, John Wilkin. Is there any scope for getting Iran banned from FIFA on account of their refusal to play matches against Israel and Israeli clubs? Football's very popular in Iran. This could make the regime more unpopular than it already is. Go on the attack, John.
Well, I think we should look into that now, actually. I think we've seen it in judo, that happening, and I think maybe that is a move we want to take. We'll have to look into what the basis for it and how what we could do about it and consider the implications. And I should say, with all these things, I do listen to and consult with what other people say. I don't always agree, but I think it's very important to hear what people think, what the implications might be before you launch into something. So just by way of an example of where we have managed to get things done, even in relation to or by deeply hostile countries. In case of badminton, I don't know whether you're going to ask Sam about that. Maybe actually if I let Sam tell about that, because I think that's...
Oh yes, do tell us the badminton story.
Well, the great thing about badminton is it's one of those, a lot of the time we don't know how effective we are. You know, we push for a result comes about, and who knows how much of a role we have. But badminton's slightly different. It's there was a junior tournament in Kiev in 2018 under the auspices of the World Badminton Federation. There's an Israeli player called Max Grinblatt, and he's paired with a Ukrainian guy in a doubles match against two Saudi Arabians. And the Saudi Arabians turn up and they take part in the coin toss, and then they march off. And the Ukrainian guy has absolutely, it was the still, there's a video, and the still from the video was used for the promoting this webinar. The Ukrainian guy knows no idea what's going on. The Israeli guy is expecting it and knows exactly what's going on. And the thing about that was, it was videoed, as I said, by their coach, who's hiding behind a pillar. So it was a setup. And then he contacted the Saudi media and promoted how they were standing up to their enemies. And we wrote to the World Badminton Federation, and we said, this completely blows apart all your rules. Never mind the marching off, the filming, the releasing to the media, the crowing, the political crowing. And they wrote back and they said, thank you for bringing this to our attention. We didn't know anything about it. And because UKLFI has brought it to our attention, we banned them all for 6 months. So it was good to know and see directly something bringing about results.
Yeah, and actually what they did was they got the Saudi Badminton Federation to ban these players. And it's worth mentioning that the Badminton Federation is actually based in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, which is not a friendly country either. So we regard this as quite an achievement of ensuring that even hostile places have to recognise that they can't treat Israelis like pariahs.
Shuttlecock diplomacy, I think we can call that one, isn't it? As the tabloid headline. Sorry, Simon.
Johnny, that was terrible.
Thank you very much. That's what I'm here for. Now we have some more questions. Looking a bit forward now, taking into consideration the effects of coronavirus, what does the panel foresee as the next challenge in terms of boycotting, whether in sports or indeed in other areas? Do you see a shift in their focus, a future-orientated question in lockdown? Simon?
Not really. I mean, the lockdown and the emergence from lockdown is creating huge issues for all sports federations. You'll know this as to when and how they can start up playing again. It's a big challenge. Events are being moved. People are talking about events being held behind closed doors, events being cancelled. I think it's a huge challenge for the sports industry, and that's a completely different subject. I personally, I don't know what fellow panelists think, I personally don't see that COVID in itself changes the tactics of the boycotters. I think it's giving some anti-Semites a whole new rich vein of abuse and invective that they can throw at Jews and Israel by trying to blame us for the COVID-19 crisis. But in terms of boycotting of Israel, I don't see that much changes. The only issue that could affect it is something that would affect all sports if events are cancelled altogether. And that would be unfortunate if Israel is qualified for a particular event which is then cancelled completely, and then they can't, they end up not qualifying for its next edition. But I don't see that as discriminatory. I just think that's the way that the whole sports industry is having to react to the impact of the COVID crisis.
Sam, do you think that this new language, this new lexicon of anti-Semitism based on COVID-19 will create new issues?
Well, what that just made me think of was actually made me think of Donald Trump, which is the only other thing that could come about is if they said, if somebody was saying things like, oh, we need to ban Israelis for security reasons or for reasons of health security or some sort of nonsense based around that. And, you know, with all the nonsense going about, it's perfectly possible somebody could come up with something insane like that as an excuse.
Okay, thank you very much for that one. We have a question for who haven't we spoken to most recently? Should we go back to Jonathan? This is for Rhonda Lees. This isn't Rhonda's area, so this is a wild guess, she asks. Is there any argument we could use if sport is televised? Here we go. This is interesting. In fact, this is a Simon question. Let's throw this to Simon. You know, in the sort of power games of international sport, who's more powerful, the governing body or the TV network? The US doesn't support or allow the game to be broadcast because of discriminatory policy. Simon, this is a very interesting modern battle between the governing body who dish out the rights and the Murdochs of this world who pay for it.
Yeah, it's all about the contractual nexus, actually, and I would be interested in Jonathan's view on this. I think contractually, provided the host agreement has the relevant non-discrimination clauses in it, then the broadcasting contract will reflect that. So actually, if the host country is in breach of those discriminatory provisions, then the broadcaster will find that there's potentially been a breach of their contract, allowing the broadcaster to get out of it and not make a payment. Now, it's not happened at all at that point. The Americans tend not to be showing live the types of events that we're talking about. It absolutely would do. I mean, if you can imagine that if Israel qualified for Qatar 2020, whenever it's going to be held, and there's some sort of discrimination in breach of the FIFA contract by Qatar, and FIFA doesn't act on it, you can be pretty sure that any broadcaster around the world might be able to say that FIFA's in breach of their contract and refuse payment. And US networks would be very, very willing to do that, I think. And there's no question, politics, sport, and legal matters really do work in sport, but money is louder than all of those.
Indeed, Jonathan, that's Julian's follow-up question from our audience. Jonathan, could you just expand on the American anti-boycott laws and how they work exactly?
Well, there are a whole series of them. There are federal laws which deal with state boycotts, at the moment at any rate. And then there are a whole series of separate laws by individual US states. And there's a variety of them. Some of them enable the state to, or require the state not to invest public funds, pension funds and so on, in companies that participate in boycotts. Others require public contracts not to be awarded. Others give a right to damages by someone who's affected by a anti-Israel boycott. Some of them only apply to boycotts of territory of Israel or companies operating or whatever within the green lines. Others apply to any territory that is administered by Israel, ruled by Israel. Include the West Bank and the Golan and East Jerusalem. And these were used very, very effectively when Airbnb tried to drop Israelis who were advertising accommodation in East Jerusalem and the West Bank on their platform. And Airbnb had to reverse that policy. Now, in relation to FIFA, we did actually think about this, about the possibility of involving broadcasting rights in the United States. And we did mention it to someone. I don't think it got followed up because other things intervened and we got our result in other ways. But in the case of football, of course, that's not so big in the United States, so it wasn't such a valuable point there. But in other areas, for example, the Olympics, it might well have clout. And it's certainly something that we want to be looking at as a possible string to our bow. And very often these things, FIFA was an example in point, you want to actually have several different strands particularly when you're facing a complicated issue and lots of people putting points against you. You want to operate at several different levels on our side.
Another question from the floor, some great questions. Thank you very much for all your contributions. From Jay Bowers. I appreciate there are rules about participants in sport, guaranteed that Israeli footballers should be absolutely entitled to be playing in the World Cup finals in Qatar. But what about spectators, supporters, fans? Are there not Arab countries which do not normally permit Israelis to attend? What about the Israeli Barmy Army, Simon?
Well, as I said on the FIFA contract for 2022, and I know about this because I had to sign it on behalf of England's unsuccessful bid to host 2018, those provisions relating to athletes also relate to supporters. And they have to admit anybody who has validly bought a ticket. And the ticketing policy that they apply must apply and give equal rights to all the participants of other nations. So there's a minimum number of tickets that are guaranteed for the fans of the participating teams. So in FIFA's contract, at the very least, the same provisions relating to participants, athletes and coaches also apply to legitimate ticket holders. And if that's repeated across the system, then there should be no problem. That's why I think Qatar is really interesting, particularly if Israel qualifies. It will be the biggest, highest profile tournament in an Arab country. And it will be a real test of what I actually think is a very good hosting agreement that FIFA has in place.
Amazing. Should that happen, we're all gunning for Israel to qualify for Qatar. We've said it before. Ashley, thank you very much for your question. What jurisdiction, we haven't heard from Sam for a few minutes, what jurisdiction, if any, does the Court of Arbitration for Sport have in determining Israel's boycott issues?
Well, Jonny, you're not going to hear from him now. I'm going to sidestep that question to Jonathan.
I refer my right honourable gentleman to the question I asked earlier. Jonathan.
Okay, so the Court of Arbitration in Sport will only hear disputes between people who have signed an agreement giving them jurisdiction to deal with the dispute. We can't, as UK Lawyers for Israel, we can't invoke the Court of Arbitration in Sport directly. We can only say we tried to intervene, but as I mentioned, they don't allow it, which is good in a way because it prevents all the hostile NGOs constantly barracking them and trying to persuade them to do this, that, or the other on the basis of false propaganda. Oops. Sorry.
That's Qatar 2023 for you there. There you go.
Sorry about that.
I was hoping you'd answer it, actually.
Yeah. No, it's about something completely different. Yeah, so we would have to persuade FIFA or whatever to fight the case, or in some cases Israel might be a party that could, the Israeli Football Association might be a party that could bring a case, but it wouldn't be something that we could do, UK Laws for Israel.
I have a question here from Lior Eisenberg. In chess, Saudi Arabia and Tunisia were stripped from hosting after a huge campaign, large-scale and legal processes after I was banned, she says. I was banned from entering Saudi Arabia. There are so many incidents that aren't getting to the media. For example, April 2014 in Taekwondo, what happened after it? It's like whack-a-mole, isn't it? It's just never ending this. No one seems to know. It's a must that there'll be a legal action after a ban. And the second point that Lior wants to make is the responsibility should be more on the sports organizations to make sure that players will not be boycotted rather than countries that are known from the start that where there's a problem. Only best efforts are the level that the CAS is okay with and not 100% responsibility, especially in the bid process. So what is done to change the situation at sports governing body levels and the CAS?
Jonny, can I slip in on this one, having dodged the last one? Again, this is it's good to speak after Simon, because he always raises such interesting points that I can pick up on. It's talking of changes for the future. One of the great things is these contracts about the spectators is great, because what we've seen in the past with these events like the Taekwondo in Tunisia and stuff is sporting bodies say, we're quite happy for these people to play. We'd be delighted if these Israelis play. But unfortunately, the government, there's nothing we can do. The government won't let them in. It's the government's fault. It's nothing to do with us. And what we need to do is tighten that up and not let and say to sporting organisations which don't currently have this, well, it's down to you. You know that there might be a problem with your government. You have to satisfy us that the government will let them in before we award you this championship. There's another issue with this, which is we as an organisation often don't have any standing. So Jonathan was talking also about working with the Israeli Football Federation. We can go to people and say, you're breaking your rules, but we're not in any position to enforce those rules with the organisation. So we sometimes need to work with partners within who are covered, who do have standing, to allow results to be achieved. But there's another side to that, which is that we can achieve results actually because we're not involved. If a federation or an individual player is part of an organisation, they've got future political consequences by taking an action that we don't have. And working with Jonathan on some stuff, I know that we've started working on some stuff, and we've had to pull back because we've engaged with people who do have positions within the organisations, and they've actually decided that in the end they didn't want to pursue it. And actually, some of those times I think we'd have been better off just not working with organisations and coming in as outsiders, being able to present ourselves as a neutral and independent force, even if we do have that problem with standing.
Simon, you wanted to pick up from that?
Yeah, just on Leor's point about what can be done with the federations, and Sam talking about how very often the host nation says, oh, it's not up to us, it's the rules of our government. I mean, the federations can be strong enough and not award the event to those countries in the first place. But crucially, and again, I hate to do this, but FIFA is probably one of the best models for this, because what they do is they ask the government to back up the give guarantees to enforce the obligations of the host nation. And one of those guarantees that has to be given is relating to immigration policy and allowing athletes and fans to come in. So the Qatar government's obligations are backed up. Sorry, but the Qatar host nations events are backed up by the Qatar government. That, I think, is the model. FIFA can do it, but it's starting to happen now in other sports. Other football events are doing this. And I'm sure that that's now going to spread, the idea of a government guarantee for the contractual obligations given by the host entity.
Yeah, and if I can say, we are steadily making progress in relation to chess. I think I don't want to say too much about it because things are in course, but we're on it.
Excellent. Gentlemen, we have nearly done 1 hour. So I think what we will do, in the spirit of great Jewish broadcasters of the present and past, have a Jerry's final word. Is there anything you'd like to add in the 30 seconds before you say be careful and look after each other that hasn't been mentioned so far? Start with Jonathan.
Well, I want to say, first of all, thank you everyone for participating in this webinar, but to put in a quick plug, because coming up on Sunday, we're marking the centenary of the San Remo Conference of 1920, at which the Allies agreed to grant Britain the mandate for Palestine in order to establish the Jewish national home in accordance with the Balfour Declaration, leading to the establishment of the State of Israel, which we're also about to celebrate on Yom Ha'atzmaut, Independence Day, which starts in the evening of the 28th of April. So to celebrate, we are posting a series of videos of superb short talks about the San Remo Conference and its significance by Professor Eugene Kantorovich, Natasha Hausdorff, Dr. James Vaughan, Dr. Matisse de Blois, and others. And those will be on our website, uklficharity.com/resources/San-Remo. So thank you all for joining. Take care, keep well, see you again soon.
Jonathan Turner, Simon.
I think that the position on sporting boycotts, you know, in the 6.5 years I've been with the JLC, this was a big issue at the beginning. There's been very little in the last couple of years. My sense, no one is complacent, that because of a lot of hard work and a lot of cooperation between us all, the stone is rolling in the right direction now. I think that the boycotters have had a real go at trying to use sport to get at Israel. It didn't work. They threw all their efforts into the FIFA effort, and it didn't work. It came up short. So whilst there might be the occasional hotspot where this breaks out, I think by and large we're ahead on this. So I think people should take comfort. There's a lot of very good work, good cooperation, and some very good, wise people involved in this who are having some results.
Very heartening indeed. And Sam Green.
Yeah, I'd like to echo Simon there, and I'm not entirely sure what the right direction is for a stone to roll in, but whatever it is. This is a demonstration. I mean, Simon has outlined the model approach that is now being adopted in football. And Lior raised the fact that in the past, that hasn't been adopted by some of the, what might be termed as secondary sports in terms of viewership and participation. And what we've seen in the last years, and some of the things cases we've outlined today, is actually it's changing. It's a hopeful, sport is a hopeful model. It's from a situation that was very parlous in recent times, it's become a lot better, and that is at some part, great or little, who knows, down to concerted action that has achieved it. I mean, it shows that we can do it in other areas, and we can get on with it and do it.
I want to say thank you very much. It's been a real privilege to host such a variety of expertise, not just in the sort of big headline sports, but in the minority sports, right across badminton, judo, Paralympics and chess even. So a very, very wide and varied discussion. Thank you very much to Jonathan Turner, to Simon Johnson, and to Sam Green. It's always a pleasure to work with UKLFI, so thank you to Caroline and Jonathan Turner. And I suppose I should say my name's Jonny Gould, but there it is in the bottom. And I think we've done exactly an hour. So thank you very much indeed for watching. And there is a recording of this for future audience.
Thank you, Jonny.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jonny. Well done.
Thank you, Jonny.